Hey, push on. Tell me your favorite chapter. Mine is 15 and 16. Ow!
Chapter 15. What is freedom?
Blacks and freedom. African Americans' understandings of freedom was shaped by their experiences as slaves and their understanding of the freedom around them. To them, freedom was defined as escaping the numerous injustices of slavery, such as whippings, separations of families, denial of access to education, and the sexual exploitation of black women by their owners. They openly held mass meetings and religious services free of white supervision. Religion in the secret slave church was strengthened. Methodist and Baptist were the most practiced religions, and the church was not only for worship but for community meetings. Former slaves left the South in search of better jobs or to look for family. Freedom altered the relationships within a family, changing the roles men and women were expected to have. Black people abandoned white-controlled religious institutions to create churches of their own. Black people were eager to be educated and went to missionary-established schools. Emancipated slaves subscribed to the free labor principle, which states that they should be given the same opportunities for advancement as Northerners. Recovery in the South. The Freedmen's Bureau, established by Congress in March 1865, took on responsibilities of establishing schools, providing aid for the poor and elderly, settling disputes between whites, blacks, and freed people, and securing equal treatment for former slaves and white unionists in court. Sharecropping dominated the South and was defined by black Americans renting shares of plantations but continuing to work under white plantation owners. This quickly became more and more oppressive, which was reminiscent of slavery. Black codes. Black codes were laws put in place in the South to regulate the lives of former slaves. These laws gave them the right to legalized marriage, ownership of property, and limited access to the courts. However, they denied them the rights to testify against whites, to serve on juries, or in state militias, or to vote.
The Radical Republicans. Thaddeus Stevens, leader of the Radical Republicans in the House of Representatives, wanted to confiscate the land of disloyal planters and give it to former slaves. Charles Sumner was another prominent radical in Congress. Andrew Johnson and civil rights. Andrew Johnson was nominated for vice president in 1964. He issued a series of proclamations, one of which being a pardon to white Southerners who took an oath to the Union. At this time, there was also a Republican majority in Congress, which was divided by the issue of slavery. They proposed two important bills, both of which were vetoed by Johnson. Reconstruction legislation. The 14th Amendment ensured birthright citizenship and due process. The Reconstruction Act temporarily divided the South into 5 military districts and called for the creation of new state governments. The 15th Amendment prohibited the federal and state governments from denying the right to vote because of any race.
Some more legislation added during the Reconstruction era were the Enforcement Acts and the Civil Rights Act of 1875. Impeachment and the election of Grant. The Tenure of Office Act was passed, which barred the president from removing certain office holders without consent of the Senate. Johnson was impeached, but his lawyers assured that if acquitted, he would stop interfering with Reconstruction policies. Reconstruction was the central issue in the 1868 campaign. Women's issues. Women saw Reconstruction as an opportunity to claim their own emancipation. They demanded liberalizing divorce laws and recognition of women's control over their own body. Some opposed the 15th Amendment because they thought their rights should be prioritized over the rights of Black Americans. There was a major divide in the movement as a result. Political action by African Americans. African Americans attended meetings to fight for their rights to equal citizenship, privileges, and immunities. The creation of the 15th Amendment allowed African Americans to support Republicans for Southern offices and elect themselves into positions of power. Carpetbaggers were Northern Reconstruction officials who moved to the South post-war. Some were very corrupt, and most were former Union soldiers. Scalawags were Southern-born white Republicans, and they were particularly disliked by Confederate veterans. They were considered traitors to their race and region. Economic growth in the South. Reconstruction governments focused on railroad construction to create better opportunities for African Americans and poor whites by developing the economy. Southern society should transform into major factories, busy towns, and diversified agriculture. The end of Reconstruction. The bargain of 1877 was a deal made by a Republican and a Democrat congressional commission, where they agreed if Rutherford B. Hayes won the election, even though he did not receive the popular vote, in return the withdrawal of troops in the South would take place. The rise of the KKK occurred as a result of the bargain, because there was no one there to enforce them.
Chapter 16. America's Gilded Age.
The Second Industrial Revolution.
There was a rapid expansion of industry, and industrial cities exploded, and the Great Lakes region became the center of the Second Industrial Revolution. This was made possible by transcontinental railroads. Dramatic economic growth was extremely unstable, and trusts were legal devices where a single director manages several rivaling companies. Andrew Carnegie accumulated enormous wealth and economic power through his steel company. Vertical integration was a company producing its own supplies and providing for distribution of its products. John D. Rockefeller dominated the oil industry and fought efforts to form labor unions. Robber barons were individuals who wielded power without any accountability in an unregulated market. Horizontal expansion, what a corporation acquires with competitors to eliminate competition. And economic growth was not distributed evenly between classes. Workers suffered dangerous and brutal working conditions and low wages. Americans struggled to make sense of the new social order, and debates over political economy engaged the attention of millions. There was distrust between employees and employers. Liberal reformers broke from the Republican Party in 1872 to help bring change in Northern opinion regarding Reconstruction. Social Darwinism was the application of Charles Darwin's theory of natural selection to society. This justified class distinction and explained poverty by survival of the fittest. They wanted less government involvement. William Graham Sumner believed freedom meant a person can buy and use his own property without government interference. The principle of free labor was workers demanded government-enforced 8-hour workdays and unemployment relief. Munn v. Illinois upheld the constitutionality of an Illinois law that established a state board and power to regulate fees charged by grain storage facilities. Wabash v. Illinois, the court reversed itself, ruling that only the federal government could regulate railroads engaged in interstate commerce. United States v. E.C. Knight Company ruled that the Sherman Antitrust Act could not be used to break up sugar refining monopolies. And Lochner v. New York voided a state law establishing 10 hours per day or 60 hours per week as the maximum hours of workers for bakers. The Knights of Labor were the first group of organized, skilled, and unskilled workers. The social gospel insisted that freedom and spiritual self-development depended on the equalization of wealth and power, and this was supported by the Protestant Church. The Haymarket Affair happened in May of 1886. It was a string of violent action taken by anarchist strikers in Chicago, resulting in the death of eight anarchists put on trial for conspiracy to murder. The Knights of Labor reacted, aiming to end police forces and court injunctions against strikes. Politics in the Gilded Age. Powerful corporations and monopolies gained increasing influence in the government, creating questions of political freedom. United States democracy was strong in the Gilded Age, thanks to strong support systems for either parties, close elections, and large voter turnout. State governments took on more responsibility for public health, welfare, and education.
Girl, thanks for listening. Now you know everything. Go get a 5 on your exam. Ow!